Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good day. I want to welcome all of you. My name is Herb. I am an alcoholic, and you are about to spend some time with me and the tribe that is here today to talk about steps 8, step 9, and the forgiveness process. First, I'd like to introduce you to Melissa, who is a staff at the Mary and Joseph Retreat Center, who is administering as well as sponsoring this series. Melissa?
Good morning, everybody. Hello to everybody. I see a lot of familiar faces. I'm starting to feel so part of this I feel like I'm part of this family now. I wanted to introduce Herb Kagan. He's been connected to the Mary and Joseph Retreat Center for many years, and he's truly part of our family. His 12-step and centering prayer groups have been extremely popular at the retreat center for decades, and now since the start of the pandemic, he has moved these popular offerings to Zoom. Herb's journey includes 7 years in Claretian Seminary, a graduate education in psychology, 40 years in human resources consulting, certification as a spiritual director, 37 years of active participation in a 12-step fellowship, and the publication of 3 books on spiritual awakening. We are delighted that he is donating the proceeds of these Zoom gatherings to our retreat center during this difficult time. Thank you so much, Herb. And if you're ever in the Rancho Palos Verdes area, please come and visit our retreat center. We are open, 8 acres of lush garden. So if you want a little snippet of what our campus looks like, please visit maryjoseph.org. Thank you so much.
The Mary and Joseph Retreat Center is, as I mentioned, a mile or so from my house, has been for 45 plus years. And it was the resource that was available to my wife to find recovery, and then for me to be tag teamed to find recovery. And it is the place that has the very first AA meeting that I ever went to back in early 1984. Enough about me on that standpoint. What we have here is a journey today. It's going to be a short journey. Well, by my standards, an hour and a half. It's the path to freedom is what I'm calling it. It came to me last year that it would be good, given the Zoom resource and technology, to record some material that I have with regard to the steps and maybe do 1 step a month. Well, of course, that sounds nice when you think about it logically, but when you come to implement it mechanically, it doesn't work when you come to the 4th step because it takes more time. And so I've divided it up in a way that made sense so that I can cover the 12 steps over the 12-month period this year. And this year we're doing steps 8 and 9 and forgiveness. Forgiveness is a broad and big topic. In fact, I'm dedicating a 3-hour session to it in September. And I'm very happy to announce that Fred Luskin, who wrote the book on forgiveness, it's called Forgive for Good, has agreed to co-facilitate that workshop with me. You're the first to know that publicly. A flyer will be going out sometime before the end of this month on that. So that promises to be quite a interesting event. This is one of my favorite cartoons. I picked it up 40 years ago in the New Yorker magazine because it so represents us, maybe the human beings, but certainly us as addicts. Whether we're substance addicted or process addicted, it doesn't matter. It's the bondage of addiction. And we don't seem to be able to deal with it very effectively. In fact, the big book suggests powerlessness. I like the word no choice. When I start, no choice, I cannot stop. When I stop, no choice, I cannot stay stopped. But the real problem is unmanageability. And that's been my bullseye target now for the last 3 to 5 years, not focused on addiction because it is a problem. It's just not the problem. The problem is unmanageability. The problem is the spiritual malady. The problem is the cancer of the soul that Bill talks about. The Oxford group talked about, the predecessor group to Alcoholics Anonymous. How do we find freedom? That's why I've dedicated literally my conscious life and all of my time to helping people understand, accept, embrace, and absolutely apply these 12 steps to their personal lives, because it is the formula for freedom. And steps 8 and 9 are the final steps in that process of getting free from both the addiction and from unmanageability. Steps 1 through 9 are for the deflation of the ego at depth. That's what Bill said. Steps 1 through 9, that's the program of recovery from addiction. But he's very clear. Steps 10 through 12 is the program of spirituality, the program of life. In fact, Bill calls it our way of life, the best kept secret in the rooms. And we'll be talking about that more in depth in the following months. So ask yourself a question. I experienced this methodology in the hospital that my wife was in 1984. They asked me a question that I'd never been asked before. I was there to support her recovery. I wasn't there because I had a problem. I mean, my problem was my wife, and she was a drunk. Everybody knew it. She knew it. I knew it. The kids knew it. That's why she went into the hospital. I went there to support her, white knight that I am. Clueless, as it turns out to be. But they asked me a question. What is your relationship with alcohol? Do an autobiography, just of, not of any of the drama or your life or your feelings about it, quite frankly, but do an autobiography of your relationship with alcohol. It was the key that opened the door to seeing the problem, to finding a solution that gave me a life. I hope you followed all of that. I'd been looking for something all my life. As Melissa confirmed, and you may have heard it, I was a monk for 7 years. 17 to 24, I was studying to be a Catholic priest. I was a monk committed to a religious order, poverty, chastity, and obedience. And what I didn't know when I signed up and went in is it was also committed to silence for those years in the monastery, in the seminary, in the training formation period. Yeah, 7 years of silence. I loved it. That's a story for a different day. But I had lots of questions and lots of answers in that experience, but nothing touched me because it was all in my head. It was all external. Nothing ever came inside of me. I put on a black robe and I called myself a monk, but I left and took off the black robe because I wasn't acting like a monk. You can read between the lines. I studied psychology for several years. To become a psychologist, if I couldn't save your life, your soul, I would at least help heal your emotions. I did the therapy and all the graduate work that goes along with becoming a therapist. But I didn't find what I was looking for. It was all from the outside. It was all in the head. Nothing was inside. But I didn't know that I didn't know, and I couldn't see that I didn't see. Because I never took the questions personally. They were logical things to think about and come to a logical conclusion. But this question, what's your relationship with alcohol? In bullet points with no emotion, just the facts. That began to open me up on the inside. And then they had me read it out, the writing that I did, to a group of people in that hospital. And for the very first time, it washed over me. Oh, wow, I think I have a problem with alcohol. Notice I didn't say I'm an alcoholic. Oh, no. I didn't even know enough to say that. But I could see that there were problems, and I saw it not just in my head, I saw it in my heart and my gut, which opened me up to hearing some direction, to giving me some willingness to take direction. Because I had done the best I could up to that point with traditional religion, formal psychology, and informal self-help and human development. I had done the best I could. I knew I had a problem. I didn't know what it was. And now I was beginning to see what the problem was. So the question was so much more important than the answer. I had lots of answers, but I didn't have the questions. And when I had the proper question and I took it into my heart, into my soul, into my insides, the question, then the information that I got could hang on something that had meaning. It could allow me to take some action, which gave me an experience, which allowed me to ask more questions. Oh, I have a drinking problem. Now what? And I was then humbled enough to hear the suggestions. Go to a meeting, get a sponsor, get a big book, read a big book, work the steps. It took me 4 years in the program of Alcoholics Anonymous, calling a sponsor every day, going to a meeting every day. It took me 4 years to thaw out so that, in fact, I could hear some additional questions and take some additional action and get some additional information and have a brand new experience. When I worked the steps in 1988, the very first time, and I had a spiritual awakening because I had an experience with column 4 of the resentment inventory. I had other minor experiences that journey through the steps, but that was the life-changing curtain parting experience that began my connection to, from an experience standpoint, the answer to my problem. My problem wasn't alcohol at that point. That was a gift of abstinence and freedom from alcohol that was given to me on February 21st, 1984. I have not had a drink nor an inclination to drink since then. And I didn't go to AA until 2 months later. But here I am in 1988 working these steps, having a spiritual awakening for the very first time because of the questions. And in 1991, 3 years later, having a broader spiritual experience because of column 3 in the resentment inventory. No, I didn't do it in order. You don't have to do the steps in order. Yes, I know the old timers say they're numbered for a reason, and they're quite right, absolutely. But God works in mysterious ways. And when I'm ready, something opens up in me that may not be chronological or logical. And 3 years later, in 1994, a man asked me a new question. Are you able to set aside your knowledge and your experience to have new knowledge and a new experience? Look at me right now. He said, you have a lot of information, but you have very little transformation. You have a lot of knowledge in your head from all of the background that I've just given you a Reader's Digest version of. but it's not been filtered through your heart to your feet in any existential way. You have a lot of knowledge, but you don't have a lot of change. And I knew that he knew that I didn't know. And that opened up my life again. And I became a finder, not just a seeker. Is my life a serial suffering? At that point, 1994, 10 years sober, having had 2 spiritual awakenings, I was able to say, yes. I had never understood or experienced unmanageability. I had never understood or experienced the spiritual malady, the cancer of the soul. I was restless, irritable, and discontent, despite all of the prior knowledge and work and experiences that I'd had. I had finished steps 8 and 9 in 1988 and in 1991. And as a result of that, I got a lot of freedom. Absolutely. Come on. It's progressive, this recovery, in the same way that our addiction is progressive. Fortunately, the recovery is much more, has much more facility, is much quicker than the addiction disintegration process. So it's not year for year. Again, spiritual math, 1 + 1 in regular math equals 2. But spiritual math is 1 + 1 = 5. And I realized that when I stood on the path and looked back over my shoulder, and I knew I did a lot of work. Every time I did the steps, I did a lot of work, but the outcome was disproportionately larger than my contribution to it. There was no explanation for the outcome that I had, other than grace, other than God, other than a power, other than myself. You can pick your story about how it happens and why it happens. It's a mystery to me. I don't know how it works. I do know that it works. I know how it works in terms of the step process and the methodology, but underneath, I do not understand the spiral dynamics. Oh, the steps are the steps. And some people, and I did, see them as linear. You walk up the steps to freedom. Yeah, well, it's more a spiral dynamic as far as I'm concerned, because of the experience I've had of revisiting the steps and going deeper or going higher and having a broader, more intense experience of freedom. Ask yourself today, as you're sitting here, you may be dealing with addiction, and that might be your problem. We've got several people in several rooms who are in recovery homes. So you're clearly within a day or a month or a year of having a problem with your substance and or process addiction. Alcohol, drugs, and food being the substance, process being everything else. Codependency, for instance, pornography, for instance, relationships, for instance. We deal with our primary addiction, and perhaps as a result of the steps or some other miracle and gift, you have freedom from that and abstinence for a week or a month or a year or 10. But if you don't treat the spiritual malady, the unmanageability, the cancer of the soul that I talked about in a little bit ago, the addiction pops up in a different place, kind of like whack-a-mole. You hit the little gopher down in the hole, but it pops up in a different place. That's the nature of addiction. It's not an unusual experience for me to sponsor people, men, who go through the steps and have just a wonderful experience of freedom from their addiction. And 10 years later, they have a terrible problem with food, or a terrible problem with pornography, or a terrible problem with exercise, or a terrible problem with relationships. Unless we treat the spiritual malady. And that's what Bill says in the big book, we're not cured. We have a daily reprieve. Do you really believe in the 12-step process? Do you really believe that you are powerless, AKA you have no choice? That your willpower is your gift that makes you human, but that your willpower is ineffective, not only just to manage your addiction, but to manage your life, to manage reality, to manage reality. The Serenity Prayer is the prayer that is mouthed more often than not with very little intention or understanding of what it means. The Serenity Prayer is a prayer of intention. What is reality? How can I deal with what I can influence? How can I see what I can't influence? I need wisdom. I can't develop it on my own. It's got to be a gift. And that's the prayer. Do you believe that your life can change? Of course, I'm speaking now to the choir because you wouldn't have given up this time on a Saturday paying money to listen to me, spending an hour or two thinking about what I'm saying, hopefully, and how you're living, hopefully applying what I'm saying to how you're thinking and how you're feeling and how you're living. That's the whole point of this. But ask yourself, do you really believe it? I mean, really believe it? The prayer that this man gave me is called the Set Aside Prayer. He quoted the big book on page 58 when he gave it to me. Some of us have tried to hold on to our old ideas, and the result was nil until we let go absolutely. He said, are you able to let go of your old ideas? Absolutely. I knew it wasn't a trick question, and I had enough consciousness to say absolutely not. It's a prayer like the Serenity Prayer. The intention is, I need help. I have information, I have experience, but I don't know what I don't know, and I can't see what I don't see. And please bring this is a prayer for spiritual intervention. Bring a crowbar and open up my mind and open up my heart. I'm willing to know differently. I'm willing to behave differently. I'm willing to have a new experience, but I have no idea what that means or how to do it. Please join me. You're on mute. You're welcome to join me out loud. You're welcome to join me quietly, or you're welcome to just have a positive intention about having an open mind and an open heart. God, please set aside everything that I think I know about myself, my unmanageability, the 12 steps in you for an open mind and a new experience with myself, my unmanageability, the 12 steps, and especially you. Those of you who have had exposure to me previously, you might have paid attention enough to know that that prayer has been changed. Yes, probably 4 weeks ago. I've been toying with it, meditating about it for several years, unwilling to change a prayer that I had adopted 20 years ago, changing it periodically over time. But I've been focused, as I mentioned earlier, on the second half of the first step for the last several years, unmanageability as the problem, not the addiction problem, but the human problem. And so it came to me in that meditation to eliminate the word brokenness and replace it with unmanageability. Just feels right to me. I wanted to bring that to your attention so that you could adopt it and adapt it to your own personal consciousness and needs at this time. We're talking about 12-step spirituality. I like to begin like the big book does. It's really good pedagogy, a context. Where are we? Where have we been? What are we doing? What is what we're about to do today fit into the bigger picture? 12-step spirituality, those 3 steps are about power. Bill calls it a rocket launch into the 4th dimension. What a great poetic metaphor. Rocket launch into the 4th dimension. The 4th dimension at that time, in 1939, the consciousness of Bill and the consciousness of the culture, 4th dimension meant the immaterial dimension. The first 3 dimensions, height, width, and depth, are the material dimension, 3D, height, width, and depth. The 4th dimension is immaterial, the invisible, the spiritual, in contrast to the human. Rocketed into the 4th dimension. The metaphor has a lot of power. We have to get into the rocket. Hello, that's our willingness and action. But once you get in the rocket's going to take you where the rocket takes you. And that's my experience. We begin working the steps, and then the steps begin working us. And then it's a co-creation relationship for the rest of your life if you pay attention and stay conscious and lean gently up against this, what I call the dimmer switch. My favorite metaphor, the dimmer switch, a spiritual awakening. We press the button when we start this work, and the lights go on with a little bit of juice, a little bit of power. And as we work these steps, each step, each day, each process, each experience, we lean gently against that dimmer switch and push it forward, click, click, click. And the lights get a little brighter, but we don't know it because it's really subtle. Click, click, click. And the lights get a little brighter, but we really don't know it because it's beyond our ability to see. Until, in fact, there's enough light from the accumulated clicks that we can see that we didn't see. It's astonishing, sometimes embarrassing. And we stay faithful to the process, and we lean gently into this dimmer switch with our shoulder, and we move it forward gently, gently, gently. No violence here. No violence here. No extraordinary efforts here. Gentle, gentle, gentle. We take direction, we listen, we apply it more or less consistently, more or less diligently, more or less faithfully. We're not perfect. Bill had that insight at the bottom of page 60, where he talks about progress, not perfection. That first stage of the rocket launch is a relationship with power. That's my definition of spirituality, relationship. A relationship with power, a relationship with myself. The second stage of the rocket launch, steps 4 through 7. We're going to talk today, eventually. I'm sure I'm going to get to it. Steps 8 and 9, this third stage of the rocket launch. This is the final stage before we are placed in orbit. Yeah, in step 10, Bill says we enter the world of the spirit. We're in orbit around the light at that point. Now, all along, there are some levers within each of these stages that we're responsible for. This isn't magic fairy dust from Disney. We got into the rocket ship, a little willingness and a whole lot of grace. And the rocket ship's taking us to where it goes, but not without a little bit of help from us. We have some understanding and we have some action to take in order for the alchemy to happen. I use that word very strategically. Alchemy. If you haven't been familiar with it, clearly look it up in a dictionary. Historically, it comes from the Middle Ages, where some snake oil salesmen knew that there were gullible people and said, hey, if you buy my potion or my liquid or my magical powder, you can turn iron ore into gold. Everybody wants the easier, softer way, and they were able to make a living out of it. That was called alchemy. A pseudoscience of turning iron ore into gold. But I use it here as a word that turns our self-centeredness into other-centeredness, and it's not a pseudoscience. It's a true spirituality. It's a true conversion. It's a true spiritual awakening or spiritual experience. Look in Appendix 2 if you haven't got a real grasp on what a spiritual awakening is and what a spiritual experience is and how they're the same and how they're different. That's where the dimmer switch and the light switch really help understand those two. A spiritual experience is like a light switch. Boom, automatic. A spiritual awakening is like a dimmer switch. Glacially slow in some of our cases. But we end up having a spiritual awakening as the result of these steps. That's the promise of step 12. And Bill says we can have it and we can sustain it and keep it if we do some daily things. That's a story for another workshop later on. What is that spiritual awakening? It's a change. That's really what it is. It's so simple. A term. It's a change. We don't have to get mystical or mysterious about it. It's a change. A change in what? A change in the way we think and feel and behave. So that's like the metamorphosis of a butterfly, isn't it? If you want a meditation and a spiritual experience, literally, watch the 4-minute time-lapse video on the metamorphosis of a monarch butterfly. I do it periodically because it's transformative in terms of my understanding of this transformative process, where the egg comes a caterpillar. The caterpillar curls up into a chrysalis and dies. And in that death, the monarch butterfly is created. And the strengthening of the monarch butterfly in order to fly is the challenge of breaking through the chrysalis. And it doesn't get much better as a metaphor for us. This process, especially coming through to steps 8 and 9, the death of the false self, the deconstruction of the mask and their persona that we've created. And it's done to us, not by us, but not without us. A co-creation. The gift of grace, which we don't earn, by the way, that's what grace means, gift. Freely given without any earning on our part. And yet there's this mysterious connection with our action. That's why I use the term co-creation, but not without us. The meditation that I see as the promises of step 5 on page 75 at the end of step 5. Page 75, at the end of step 5, there's a paragraph there that I call a meditation. It's the promises. And Bill talks about walking hand in hand with the spirit of the universe. Wow, what great poetry, what great mystical insight. Walking hand in hand with the spirit of the universe. So here's pathetic Herbie in his addiction that he doesn't know that he has in 1984, and also freed from his addiction, but in 1988, 1991, and 1994, progressively understanding that he's in the bondage of unmanageability. And then I find freedom. There's no difference in the cartoon other than the walls and the ceiling and the floor are not there. Pathetic Herbie's still in jail as long as he's holding the bars in front of his face. And the whole point of living in step 10 is that we've completed step 9 and we've identified that we can drop the bars. We can release, and that's what the definition of forgiveness is. Look it up, forgiveness. In my dictionary, it says a decision to release. I lay down, I release, I take my clutched knuckles off of the bars. And I am released from my addiction, and I am released from my unmanageability. The final phase of this third stage of the rocket launch is to name the harms and to make amends. Now, Bill, curiously enough, in the big book on page 76, he combines them in his comments. We are now at steps 8 and 9, he says. He doesn't do that before in any steps. He doesn't do that after in any steps. He addresses all other steps individually. I have no idea why he combined them there, except that sometimes they're a little difficult to discuss separately. But I'm separating them because they are very separatable, if that's a word. All of the even steps, hear this now as a dynamic for understanding the steps. I believe it's a tremendous insight. The two things that make us specifically human is that we have a mind that thinks, and knows. And the second component is that we have a will that makes decisions that can take voluntary actions. The steps are built that way. It's a wonderful, hopefully helpful insight that the steps are built specifically for us as human beings. All of the even steps are naming steps. All of the odd steps are decision and action steps. Take a look at that. It might be helpful to you in understanding this dynamic. That's how step 11 is built. Listen to the end of step 11. Sought through prayer and meditation to improve our conscious contact with God as we understand God. Here it is, the end of step 11, as in the big book, page 59. Praying for the knowledge of God's will and the power to carry it out. Knowledge because I need to know better. Power because I need to do better. Most of us sometimes know better. We just don't do better. And that's the nature of unmanageability, isn't it? I do what I don't want to do, and I don't do what I want to do. That was the complaint of St. Paul in the Christian scripture. The human condition, not the addict condition, the human condition. I know better, I just can't do better. Most of the time, I don't even know better. Step 8 is about knowing the harm. And my behavior isn't the harm. In fact, 100% of the time I have conversations with people about step 8, they start talking about what they did. It's interesting. It's just not relevant. Yep. What you did is interesting. It's just not relevant. It's what was the impact of what you did on another person. What are the harms? And amends has two components. Look at the screen. The first component is a change. That's for you. That's for me. When I'm making amends, I've made a decision to change my thoughts and my feelings and mostly my behavior. Why would I go to somebody to repair the damage if, in fact, I'm going to continue to create damage? That would be, there are many words for it. Insincere is the most timid. So I need to make a decision to change and have an existential relationship with steps 6 and 7. In 1988, the first time I went through the work, I had an existential experience with steps 6 and 7. I'm powerless over my character defects, but I'm 100% responsible for my behavior. I pray because I'm powerless, and I stay accountable because I'm human. If you want more on that, go to a previous workshop in the Path to Freedom where I talk about step 6 and 7. Transformative steps, a tool of change if you want to change. 100% effective, 100% effective when you get specific. But then it's about repairing the damage. And I love Chuck C's book, A New Pair of Glasses, Chuck Chamberlain. It was a book that was written transcribing a retreat that he did for some men back in the late 60s. And he says, we do a step 9 amends to balance the scale. He has in mind Lady Justice, blind Lady Justice with a scale, to balance the scale. And I love that as an image. Step 9, to repair the damage. Lots of damage that can't be repaired in any type of actual physical way. We can't change the past. But the whole purpose of step 9 is to repair that damage. So let's take a look at step 8. Made a list of all persons we had harmed. That word was so harsh for me. I had to pick another word. I used the word diminish. It really helped me. Who did I diminish physically, financially, emotionally, mentally, intellectually, spiritually? Bill gives us those lists of facets of the way we might harm somebody in the 12 and 12. Don't overlook the 12 and 12. Bill was 12 or 13 years more conscious after he wrote the big book in 1939 when he wrote and published the 12 and 12, 1953, I believe. Don't overlook it. It's a wonderful commentary. It's not a book that tells you how to work the steps. Step 6 and 7 might be a little bit of a variance on that. Step 11 has a nice suggestion. But generally speaking, it's a commentary, not a textbook. It's a commentary on Bill's experience. And became willing to make amends to them all. There's the key, very much like step 2. On page 47, Bill says, willingness is the cornerstone on the foundation to building the spiritual arch through which we walk to a new freedom. The big book has wonderful internal integrity. Willingness in step 2, willingness in step 4, willingness in step 6, willingness in step 8. Remember what I said about built specifically for us as human beings? Consistency. To make amends to them all. I hear people say, oh, well, I'll never finish my amends. Well, they're ignorant. And I don't mean that in a diminutive standpoint, a dismissive standpoint, a negative standpoint. They just don't know that they don't know. And they've probably got bad advice from people who don't know that they don't know. I finished my amends in 1988. I finished my amends in 1991. I finished my amends in 1994. Every time I've done the steps, whether it took me a year as it did the first time or 2 years as it did the last time I did the steps. I finished the amends. And I finished them within a year. It's not a prolonged journey. Now there may be, and I'll talk about it when we get to step 8, some obstacles to making amends. But if we are creative and spiritual and we get good advice from experienced people, we can finish our amends. And I'll talk about living amends when we get there in step 9. I believe in living amends, but as I interpret it. So what about Step 8. Well, I suggest people use a card, a 3x5 card, or larger if they care to, if they have more things to say. The first time I did step 8, I used a 8x11 piece of paper, and it got really messy because I put them all on there. I had probably 30, 35 amends to make. And it got really messy as I was making the amends and keeping notes. Well, later on, a man asked me to do it with a 3x5 card, which really made a lot of mechanical sense because I was able to use both sides of the card to do names and phone numbers and addresses and dates and any other kind of information that was relevant. But the most relevant information from my standpoint are, who did I diminish? Identify that. What did I do? The behavior is important in order to set the tone of evaluating, well, what harm did that behavior cause? Notice the distinction. What I did is important, but it's not the harm. Please get that clear. What I did is not the harm. Oh, I crashed a car. Oh, I stole some money. Oh, I hurt their feelings. Interesting. Now, how did that impact the other person or institution? What was the negative impact? How did you diminish their lives? What specific action is necessary? That's an item that I ask the people to add to the 3x5 card once they've done the first 3 items. I have them do the first 3 items on everybody that they are aware of at that time that they've harmed. Some of that material comes out of the 4th step and 5th step exercise, and some of it doesn't. I had no resentment for people that I stole from. I had no fear or sex from people that I stole from. I was a thief from early years through even 4 years in AA. 1984 to 1988, I had an outside sales job where I had an expense account. And I cheated on my reports every month. And I had done that my entire career with all of the employers I had. They call that being a thief. I mean, direct honesty. I was taking what I hadn't earned. And so that's another component of step 4 that I have added about dishonesty. So that in fact, we respond to the suggestion in the big book in step 8. We make a list of harms. We did so when we did our inventory. Bill connects those two. But not everything in your 4th step is a harm. Because you have a resentment for somebody doesn't mean you harmed them. Let's get real, not emotional and not new age. Let's get real. Because you resented somebody doesn't mean you harmed them. That's another myth in the rooms. Everything that's in your 4th step goes on your 8th step. No, it doesn't. It only goes on your 8th step if, in fact, you created harm. And there are harms that were done that are not in your 4th step, usually. And so we get very clear and very specific. Once they've got the first 3 items, then I ask them to put down the specific action that's necessary to repair the damage to balance the scale. Because if I give that to them too early, they will mitigate the harm, anticipating that they didn't want to do the specific action necessary to repair the harm. Even unconsciously, we will do that to cut ourselves some slack. The final question on the to answer on the card is, am I willing to repair the damage? Some people are very willing to do the easy ones. And then there's somewhat willing to do the next level. And then there are some, maybe one or two or maybe more. Hell no, they did more to me, or that was so bad, or that was so far ago, or that was so long ago, or I'm going to go to the grave and no. Well, okay. I just smile and I shake my head. Okay, great. So you've got three categories: very willing, moderately willing, and hell no. Great. I really make the recommendation, it's not in the big book, it's my experience, that people start with the easy ones first. Get a rhythm for the vocabulary, get a rhythm for the discussion, get a rhythm for the feelings, whether it's on the phone or in a letter or face to face. From my standpoint, those are all direct amends. Face to face, of course, is the primary way of doing it, but it may not be reasonable if you've called somebody to set up an appointment and they go, no, I don't want to see you. Then you'll be prepared to make the amends right there on the phone. Or if in fact you can't find somebody or shouldn't find them, perhaps a letter is appropriate. That's a direct amend. It could be indirect amend. I don't get wrapped up in semantics. It's about addressing the issue and taking the action to repair the damage and balance the scale. The big book has lots of material, as does the 12 and 12 on step 8. It's got an interesting contrast. Gosh, I'm running out of time, aren't I? It's got an interesting contrast on page 77. It says the purpose of doing this is not for ourselves. Oh, of course, it says on page 77, we are trying to put our lives in order, but this is not an end in itself, he says. Our real purpose is to fit ourselves to be of maximum service to God and the people about us. I mean, that's the resounding theme of the spiritual awakening, a turning from my self-centeredness to other-centeredness. We're not doing 8 and 9 to feel better. We're not doing 8 and 9 to stay sober. Hello? We're doing 8 and 9 to clean up the past, to repair the damage, to bring some type of healing, and I'll use that word, to some type of healing to people that we've harmed. Now, the outcome of that is our sobriety. The outcome of that is our healing. The outcome of that is our freedom. But it's a byproduct. The primary intention of steps 8 and 9 is to bring healing to them, to bring release to them. On page 76, he says, in terms of the motive for doing this, he gives us two aspects of the motive. Remember, it was agreed at the beginning we would go to any length for victory over alcohol. Well, when did we agree to that? Remember, at the beginning, it was agreed that we would go to any length for victory over our addiction. I'll broaden it because some of you are not alcoholic. Use the term of your addiction in the big book. Substitute your term for the word alcohol to make it personal. On page 58, if you have decided you want what we have, freedom, and are willing to go to any length to get it, a spiritual awakening, any length, dash, well, what does it mean to go to any length? You could ask somebody, oh, go to a meeting, oh, pick up chairs, oh, help with the pass the basket, oh, help somebody else, oh, pray. What does it mean to go to any length? The book has an answer, a direct answer. Chapter 5, how it works. If you have decided you want what we have, a spiritual awakening, and are willing to go to any length to get it, dash, then you are ready to take certain steps. This is the prelude to step 3, a commitment to turn from my self-centeredness to other-centeredness, and a commitment to do steps 4 through 9. That's what step 3 is. There's no action in step 3. It's a prayer that is a public commitment, take it with somebody else, to witness your commitment to take action. The actions are steps 4 through 9. But here it is on page 76. Remember, it was agreed at the beginning, and this is in italics, we would go to any length for victory over alcohol. Oh, the first half of the first step. And so on page 79, it makes a lot of sense when we see in that first paragraph, reminding ourselves that we have decided to go to any length, a complete redundancy to page 76. But now he's not going to talk about the first half. He's going to talk about the second half of the first step. Reminding ourselves that we have decided to go to any length to find a spiritual experience. We ask that we be given strength and direction. Remember the two things that make us human: knowledge, our mind, and action, our will. We ask, that's a prayer, that we be given strength and direction, needing to know what to do and needing the power to do it, to do the right thing no matter what the personal consequences may be. We must be willing. There are lots of synonyms for harm in the big book and in the 12 and 12. Hurt, hate, dislike, wrongs, criminal, betrayal, infidelity, negative, depressive, disturb, injure. The types of harm: physical, financial, emotional, mental, spiritual. The attitudes that are suggested is in the promises that we were painstaking. That doesn't mean pain. Look up the word, don't make it up. Painstaking. Paying attention to detail, that's all. That we were careful in hearing the direction and taking the direction and being somewhat meticulous, not perfectionistic, but doing the best that we can, knowing at the same time that we can't do the best that we can, but willing to do it anyway. That's my antidote to perfectionism. Powerless to do this right, but responsible to do it anyway. An accurate and unsparing exhaustive survey, a deep and honest search of motives and actions, naming the flaws in our makeup, listing the personality traits which disturb and injure others, a quiet and objective regret for the impact, willing to repair the damage, willing to change behavior. We pray for direction. We pray for strength. We pray for humility. We pray for the willingness. We pray for a helpful and forgiving spirit. We pray for a forgiving heart. To clean up our past is our goal, to clean up our past, to be useful going forward, to pay attention to our side of the street. Their behavior and their impact on me is none of my business. Hello? Whew, that's huge. Their behavior and their impact on me is none of my business. It's just what is. That's the seedbed for an experience of forgiveness. And then Bill quotes the letter of James, which is one of the fundamental tools that the Oxford group used, and Bill and Bob were very familiar with the letter to James in the Christian scripture. It's a page and a half, read it sometime. Faith without works is dead. Faith without works is dead. In the process of doing 8 and 9, I got real busy with my life because I got some freedom from the previous amount of step work that I was doing. And when I was meeting with my step guide, He asked me how I was doing, and I was telling him, and he said, well, when's the last time you did any step work? And I said, well, it was a month ago because I'm really busy now. I'm willing to do the step work, but I'm really busy, very hard to find time. He said, her willingness without action is fantasy. Oh, man. He took the line from James and twisted it to make it real for me. Faith without works is dead. But in my case, willingness without action was fantasy. I'm not willing if my feet are not moving. My head and my heart, my emotions will lie to me, but my feet never do. You want to be confrontational with yourself. You want to do a on-the-spot inventory. Take a look at your feet. Your feet are telling you who you are. Your feet are telling you what your principles are. Your feet are telling you about who you are. Your feet are telling you about your behavior, not your head and not your heart. It's very confrontational. You talk about a spot check inventory, step 10. But what about step 9? Made direct amends. Bill also talks about indirects in the big book as well as in the 12 and 12. To such people, wherever possible, except when to do so would injure them or others. And you hear such trivial garbage in the room sometimes. Somebody will say, well, I can't make amends to them because that would hurt me and I'm another. Not really. You're just self-centered and you don't know it. Because it is meant to hurt you. Yes, I said that very intentionally. Step 9 is meant to hurt you. The person making the amends, it is meant to hurt you. I wonder what deflation of the ego at depth means. Deflation of the ego at depth means. On page 14 in the big book, Bill has a wonderful phrase in his own story at the top of the page. Simple, but not easy. A price has to be paid. It meant destruction of self-centeredness. Woo! Destruction of self-centeredness. I must turn in all things to the Father of light, who presides over us all. There's the essence and the summary of a spiritual awakening. The turning from self-centeredness with the grace and the help of a power other than ourselves, to be in relationship, turning from the darkness to have a relationship with light. It's my favorite image these days. I'm using darkness and light a lot because it makes it simple. The amends process is simple but not easy. And it's a training that I go through with the people to, on paper, describe the harm that you did, not your behavior, but to describe the harm. Ask, is there any other harm? Suggest the amends. And ask, are there any other amends? Now, this is a 4-part dance. And it can be done directly with the person, or it can be done on the phone, or it can be done in writing. I met with my top management person in my company when I was actually resigning, a story for a different day, after 21 years to go on to another organization, but I was making amends for all of my dishonesty in terms of my fraud, my theft with regard to expense account. And I told him that for 21 years I'd been misusing the expense account. I gave him a number, which was a 6-figure number. And I said, I don't have that kind of money to pay it, but I'm willing to pay it over the next several years on a monthly basis. And I described the harm. And I said, is there anything else that you feel that I harmed the organization or the employees in it that you would like to talk about? Hear the way I phrase that, though. I describe the harm that I did as I see it. But sometimes I don't know that I don't know. I'm in a whiteout in living my life. And I don't know the impact of my narcissism on the people around me. So I ask, is there anything else that you would like to talk about? See, it's a suggestion and it's an open thing. Most people are really uncomfortable with this process and they just want it over with. So most people will sort of shut it down and say, no, I'm really in admiration of what you're doing. This is really a very profound experience. You must be quite humiliated as the result of this. And I applaud you for the path that you're on. Continue with that, or some such words. When I met with my two daughters who are in program, one in AA, one in Al-Anon, they, when I said, is there anything else you'd like to talk about? 2 hours later, we had concluded a very robust discussion because they were not shy and they knew the process. And it was very healing. So in this relationship with this boss, this executive, he said, no, he said, you've been a really good employee, and I suggest the amend that I was going to make. And he said, you know what? He said, you've really contributed wonderfully to the organization. Yes, there's been lots of missteps and lots of concerns that we've had, but overall, we're glad that you've been with us all these years. And quite frankly, we're sorry for not supporting you in a better way so that you didn't have to struggle so much and had so much emotional pressure on your own life because of our problems. And I said, is there anything else that I could do? And he said, and he dangled a set of keys in front of me. He said, you just bought a car, a company car, didn't you, a month ago? I said, well, yes, I did. I'm turning it in. He said, why don't you give me $1? And I'll give you the pink slip and we'll call it even. I mean, how does that happen? I'm there making amends for a theft of 6 figures plus. And he gives me a $60,000 car for $1. I don't know how that works. I said, thank you. I took the car. You see, if somebody says something to you, you don't need to make amends to the universe. This is my opinion on it, in contrast to some of the other opinions that I've heard in the rooms. If somebody says, no, I don't want the money back because I don't need the money and you do, and I'm grateful that you're on the path, you are released from that, AKA you are forgiven. That's the debt that you've been released from, and you've been released, and you don't owe it. And you don't owe it to the universe, and you don't owe it in a compensatory way to a nonprofit organization. Now, there may be circumstances where that will be an appropriate amend. I made amends to women generally because I had harmed them, people that I knew and people that I didn't know, by agreeing to, after invitation, to be on the board of a women's recovery home, not to deal with the women themselves, but to help them in their operations and in their fundraising. I'm still involved with them 32 years later. You see, that's my compensatory action to balance the scale. In step 9, it talks about courage and forgiving spirit and helpful, tactful, common sense, regret, calm and open, frank and honest, patient, tolerant, kindness and love, consideration and willingness, accepting responsibility and rigorous honesty. Whew, what a list. Not perfect, but progress. My intention is to be a decent human being. My intention is to repair the damage. My intention is to change my behavior. I hold myself accountable to a sponsor. At that time, to my wife. She was my partner for 52 years. She died 3 years ago. Now I hold myself somewhat transparently accountable to my two daughters. One 30 years AA, one 30 years in Al-Anon. Wisdom women that are two pillars that support me in my journey. How do you make amends to dead people? My father had been dead 12 years by that point. This man said, go to the graves. And I said, well, he was cremated. There was no grave. And he said, well, go to a cemetery then, as a symbol of a graveyard where he would be buried. This is a symbol. Go to the cemetery, take a piece of paper and a pen, and sit there and pray and meditate that he be present to you. And then as if he were present to you, you make the amend of describing the harm, asking, is there any other harm? Suggesting the amend and asking, is there any other thing that I can do to right the wrong? And I did that. I sat on a hill. I was there for 2 hours. I prayed and meditated for his presence. I wrote out the letter there. And then I read it out loud as if my father was present. It was awesome. And when I asked the final question, is there anything else that I can do? I heard a voice. Take care of your mother. That's the story. I don't put any interpretation on it. I just accepted it. And I made amends to my mother. She had disappeared several years earlier. We'd had a disagreement about money, a large amount of money. She said she loaned it. I said she gave it. Because of the program, I wrote her a check and paid the money back. But she was so angry, she moved out of town, sold everything with no forwarding address. My mother, yeah. My grandmother of my 3 children. And she was closer to them than she was to me. She was closer to my wife than she was to me. But she sold everything, moved out of town with no forwarding address. So I wrote a letter on this basis, these 4 process steps. And I took it to the union that sent her a check on a monthly basis. Because I had relationships with the union leadership, they agreed to send the letter without giving me the address because I didn't want that. In the letter, in the envelope, I put several pictures of the kids she hadn't seen for 4 or 5 years. And 2 weeks later, I got the envelope back. It had been opened, it had been read. She was still so angry that she returned the pictures of the kids. In that letter, I had said, if there's anything I can do ever for you, let me know. And 2 years later, she called and she said, you sent me a letter 2 years ago. Is that last line that you're willing to help me still valid? I said, well, hi, Mom. Nice to hear from you. Yes, of course. And I picked her up and she was destitute and alone and had been stripped of everything she ever owned by ugly people. And I brought her home and she had cancer. She had 6 months to live and we helped her die. And we restored our relationship with myself and my extended family. How do you get here from there? Making amends to dead people, making amends to people that you can't find. You be willing. How do you make amends to a wife that you abused emotionally and verbally for years? How do you make amends? 25 years married, wanting a divorce. How do you make amends? I asked her to pray with me because that's what the recommendation is in the big book. Page 70, 71, I believe is, and page 81 and 82, something like that, about amends and the harm done. Infidelity. She agreed to pray with me because she didn't know whether to stay or to leave. And I asked her if she would get on her knees with me and hold hands and look me in the eye. And I would pray out loud one day, and the next day she would pray out loud, because that was the recommendation from my step guy who had experience with that in his own family. And he had brought healing into his family and was married long-term with many children. And she was willing to do that. The first day was incredibly intimidating. The most intimate action I've ever taken in my life is to get on my knees and hold her hands and look in her eyes and pray out loud. Not a long prayer, not a editorial prayer, not a prayer commenting on anything personal, but a prayer for healing, a prayer for direction. The next day we got on our knees and held hands, and she looked in my eyes and she prayed out loud for direction and for healing. And within a week, we began talking about what we were experiencing, and that we were clear the heat was going down. And we continued that practice for 3 years on a daily basis. And we became really good friends and real partners in our life together, and really enjoyed one another. And she died at peace in her sleep 3 years ago, with no bucket list and nothing to forgive. Released and having freedom for 25 or 30 years. That's forgiveness. I could go on that, and probably will or have in my forgiveness talk on the YouTube. There is a 3-hour dedicated workshop on forgiveness. This is just a summary overview of the process of steps 4 through 9. It begins with step 4. Forgiveness begins with step 4, especially column 3, where we look at our beliefs, our delusional beliefs, and then we look in column 4 at our corrupt motives. And once we're able to see that we are responsible for our lives and the harm that we brought to other people, we don't have a part in it. The myth and the inaccuracy of the vocabulary in the rooms is sad. We don't have a part in our resentments. We have 100%, because it's our reaction to people and circumstances. Forgiveness is a decision. It's a process. It's not an event. It began with step 4. It completed with step 9, that journey. It's a process of a decision to release them. Look it up in a dictionary. It's wonderful. Look at my hand. A decision to release them. That's all you need to know and experience about forgiveness. The actions are more challenging, but the process is a decision to release them and find that you are released. Isn't that how the forgiveness prayer in St. Francis goes? To the extent that we forgive them, we are forgiven. Or the Lord's Prayer, to the extent that we release them from their debt, we are released. It's a process, though. It's not about condoning their action or forgetting it or excusing it or minimizing it. If you want more information on my experience and understanding of forgiveness, go to the YouTube and watch the presentation. I go very much in depth with many and make comments about most of these items that you see on the screen. Reading a book, Forgive for Good, by Fred Luskin, Luskin. He's a clinical psychologist, a professor at Stanford. He comes at it strictly from a psychological standpoint. He did his doctoral thesis on it 30 years ago and then wrote the book so that us people who don't have that kind of education could understand the process of forgiveness. Forgive for good. Forgiveness is a decision to not retaliate, to not exact revenge, to not seek compensation, to not judge. Whew! That's why we need the process of steps 4 through 9 and the practice of prayer throughout. Because we make a decision to release them, have an experience paradoxically of being released ourselves, finding freedom and healing. The process, as Fred Luskin outlined it in his book from a psychological standpoint, is completely parallel with the spiritual process outlined in the big book. The big book doesn't talk about it this way. And that's why I'm so thrilled that Fred Luskin evaluated it and confirmed the human process in a psychological book, Forgive for Good. We have to name it. That's what we do in step 4. How were we hurt? We have to understand it. How were we disappointed? Our hope, our expectation. What were the rules that we had? Column 3, what are our beliefs? And we find out that our beliefs are delusional. You want a short circuit way of finding out what your beliefs are? Hear yourself think or feel or say should. I should, you should, they should, the world should. The word should reveals your belief. Now, when you hold it up and look at it, it might be very cogent, very logical, very common sense. And then again, it might be a total fantasy, a total delusion. We don't get to manage reality. We get to adjust to reality. That's the serenity prayer. Adjusting to reality, because reality just is. Loving What Is the name of a book. The author's name eludes me right now. Loving What Is. She says, reality is reality. It's a very simple phrase, but hear it. Please hear it and embrace it. Reality is reality, but only 100% of the time. One of the participants in my workshop said, and the key is not to take reality personally. Oh my God, such wisdom. Do not take reality personally. Acknowledge reality. What's my attitude about it? Take responsibility for my decisions and the actions that go with it. They call it karma in the Buddhist literature. And it sounds mystical and mysterious. It's not. Karma's not. Karma merely is describing the dynamic of, the reality of, the results of my behavior, the consequences of my behavior on a daily basis, and the accumulated consequences and impact of my behavior up to the present moment. Each one of us has created our lives right now as we have it. This is in your face. And if it offends you, I apologize, but I'm actually pleased because it will disturb you enough to examine what I'm saying. Your life is exactly the life that you have designed for yourself today, because it's the accumulated results of your decisions, your feelings, and your behavior, and the consequences of that behavior up till this present moment. And if you want your life to change, change your behavior. If nothing changes, nothing changes. The whole key to spiritual awakening, the whole key to recovery, the whole key to healing, the whole key to forgiveness is to make a decision and accept responsibility for the behavior, the actions that you take, and implement those actions. Action, I heard a speaker the other day, and it was wonderful, and I hope you can hear it. He He said, do you know how to spell magic? Big pause. He's talking to a large group. It's an AA meeting and it's a speaker recorded. It was wonderful. He said, do you know how to spell magic? Action. I just love it. Exactly. Because as I stand and pause on the path of the steps and action, I look back over my shoulder and I just say, I cannot get here from there, but here I am. And it seems like magic, but it's the outcome of the gift of grace and my willingness to take action. Forgiveness is a process. It's a change in my attitude. It's a change. I accept reality as it is and not as I script it or want it to be or feel that it would be fair and should be. No, it's just what is. And I am responsible for my actions. 100%. In my meditation, I've been thinking about this. I wrote a meditation in my Way of Life document. It's on my website, the Way of Life document, part of the workshop material, a resource. In there, there's a 3-page meditation on forgiveness. It'll summarize all of this in a very concise and dense form. The process of steps 4 through 9 and the incorporation of Fred Luskin's book. I was thinking about that about 3 or 4 years ago, and this came to me. A forgiving person has no past, but an unforgiving person has no future. I mean, that's it in a nutshell. To the extent that you hold on to poison, you are poisoned. To the extent that you release poison, you are cured and healed. If you are in any way suffering, whether it's from addiction or just from life in general, there is freedom. There is freedom, but not with just magic, not with just, quite frankly, therapy and medication might be necessary. Professional help might be necessary. But in the 10-step build tells us that we enter the world of the spirit. This is after we do the 9th step. We enter the world of the spirit. We are given freedom from our addiction. We have recovered, Bill says, but we're not cured. We have physical sobriety, but we don't have emotional or spiritual sobriety. That comes as a daily exercise of 10, 11, and 12. I'm going to read this and take the time to do it because it's a gift from Dan Sherman. Here's a man who went through the steps with the same man I did 35 years ago. And he wrote his own book on a guide to working the steps out of the big book. It's a different level of suggestions that and an approach than I have, but it's so valid. Especially I got permission to use his analysis here of the bedevilments. That's the spiritual malady that's described on page 52. And the promises 30 pages later at the end of step 9. Step 1, unmanageability, the bedevilments. Step 9, the promises. We were having trouble with personal relations. We will lose interest in selfish things and gain interest in our fellow. Self-seeking will slip away. Bedevilment, we couldn't control our emotional nature. Promise, we will comprehend the word serenity and we will know peace. Bedevilment, we were a prey to misery and depression. The promise, our whole attitude and outlook upon life will change. Bedevilment, we couldn't make a living. Promise, fear of people and economic insecurity will leave us. Bedevilment, we had a feeling of uselessness. Promise, that feeling of uselessness and self-pity will disappear. What a great correlation it is. I hope Bill was conscious of it when he wrote it. Bedevilment, we were full of fear. Promise, we will intuitively know how to handle situations that used to baffle us. Bedevilment, we were unhappy. Promise. We are going to know a new freedom and a new happiness. Bedevilment. We couldn't seem to be of real help to other people. Promise. No matter how far down the scale we have gone, we will see how our experiences can benefit others. We will not regret the past nor wish to shut the door on it. In another place, he says, our past is our only asset. Without doing the steps, it's a liability. After doing the steps, our past is an asset because it gives us an ability to identify with others and them with us, and we can help them. And most of all, we will suddenly realize that God is doing for us what we could not do for ourselves. But it is a process of meetings, of course, so that we can get some traction, identify the problem, identify people who might have a problem and who can bring a solution to us. The big book is the textbook. The precise directions are in the big book. I've read most of the literature from all of the other fellowships, most of it, not all of it. Great literature, wonderful stories, great questions, but very few of them have precise directions as to go through the big book, to go through the step process. I don't care what the literature is called. There are very few pieces of literature that has the same kind of precision that the big book has, with interpretation, of course. Prayer because we're powerless, action because we're human, contrary action, that turning from self-centeredness to other-centeredness. These are all the moving parts of an effective 12-step program. But you notice I'm saving one more for you. I want to highlight it. I even put it in a different color. The most important piece is sponsorship. In the beginning, I thought meetings were the key. Meeting makers make it. I mean, I could mouth the shibboleths as well as anybody else. And then I did the steps and I became an evangelist. Oh, you must do the steps out of the big book. And then as the Spirit rounded off the edges in me, I got a real key insight. Sponsorship is the key, because if you have an effective relationship with an experienced person, hello, here are the qualities. An effective relationship, you're actually talking to them. With an experienced person, meaning they understand the big book, they've applied the steps to their personal lives, they've had a spiritual practice, they've had a spiritual awakening, they are in a reasonable way helping other people. That's a sponsor to help you navigate the big book and the step processes to have a spiritual experience, a spiritual awakening. As the Buddhists say, the teacher is the person that points the way to the light. That's the role. Points the way to the light. Unfortunately, many people begin worshiping the finger, the book or the meetings or the sponsor or the process or prayer or even sponsorship or even action. You see, the whole point of the big book and the 12-step process is not addiction. It's about a light, relationship with the light. It's a process, though. That dimmer switch is a process of integration. Physical sobriety is the promise of the first 9 steps. Emotional sobriety is the promise of 10, 11, and 12. I've used the term spiritual sobriety because I like 11 and 12 as a spiritual coin, having 2 sides. Notice, though, it's an integration, a process that takes time, that dimmer switch that moves up a click at a time, but it disintegrates a click at a time. Dr. Tebow, the psychiatrist that helped Bill Wilson, made it very clear. Bill had it right. The first 9 steps are for the deflation of the ego at depth. The first 9 steps, deflation of the ego at depth. But the ego, he said, Dr. Tebow, the psychiatrist that was helping Bill with his own personal life as well as with the program, Dr. Tebow said, the ego has an uncanny way of regenerating itself. beautiful. And with a little bit of untreated unmanageability, spiritual malady, a resentment that's not addressed, a fear that's not disclosed, a secret that is held, the darkness descends, the obsession we're vulnerable to. And when we're vulnerable to the obsession, we find ourselves in relapse. I heard a man say in early recovery, the drink is not the relapse. It's the evidence of the relapse. Brilliant. But I read about a psychologist last year that I was reading, said the disintegration doesn't begin with the relapse. He said it begins with the first compromise. Oh my God, think about it. The relapse begins not with the drink or the food or the behavior. The relapse begins with the first compromise. That's in your face. Bill suggests a way of life. Step 10, to keep the channel clear. Step 11, to fill the channel. Step 12, to empty the channel. This is our way of life, he says. We're not cured. We have a daily reprieve. Condition based on the maintenance and the fostering of our spiritual condition. A daily reprieve, not cured. He doesn't refer to our addiction, I believe. He's referring to our unmanageability. He's referring to the spiritual malady. He's referring to our human condition. That self-centeredness that is organic and needs to be addressed as our brokenness, needs to be addressed as the cancer of our soul on a daily basis. We call it a practice. My own spiritual director says each person on a spiritual path has a spiritual practice. And they practice their practice. And they're faithful to their practice. And when they're faithful to their practice is faithful to them. If you want to ask a question, make a comment, share an experience, even have a disagreement, open to it all.
My question for you has to do specifically with amends. When I work with sponsees, and sometimes they have committed criminal crimes.
Oh, yes.
And so I was just wondering if you have any advice on dealing with that type of an amends.
Yeah, lots of advice, lots of experience with that. It's a great question. Thank you for asking it. And number one, the attorneys in my group over the years have indicated to me, and that's the reason I have people sign the participant agreement, that this work can create all kinds of impact and consequences for people in terms of their emotions and their psychological stability. So the participant agreement says that you are aware of that, and I'm not responsible for it. I'm not responsible for your spiritual awakening, and I'm not responsible for your mental breakdown, if that's what you have. Second, that the fourth step and fifth step notes are subject to being called on legally by the courts as evidence, so that you're not a protected person. Your question is so really pertinent, that psychologists and psychiatrists and doctors and attorneys and some clerics have an exemption that they cannot be subpoenaed for information that is totally confidential, but nobody else does. So a person hearing a fifth step needs to make sure that if in fact there's going to be stuff that is criminal and or of that nature, that they suggest a person disclose that to an attorney or a therapist, so that you're not putting yourself in any type of jeopardy. In terms of making amends, the man who took me through the steps knew that he didn't have experience in one of my amends that I needed to make, and that was to a woman that I had harmed 25 years earlier. And he had the humility to say to me, and the awareness, go find a woman in the program who has experience with the amends process and ask her if she had been that woman that you harmed 25 years ago, would in fact you want to even have it addressed? And if you did, how would you want it addressed? And I did that. I went to a woman who had lots of experience. I had trusted her spiritual program and her experience with the 9-step. She gave me precise instructions. She said, yes, that would probably be very appropriate for you to make contact with that woman that you haven't had any contact with 25 years. And here's how to do that. I won't go into the details of it. And I made the contact. And at the end of the conversation with that woman, she said, thank you so much for the contact. This has released me. This has been so healing for me. None of those words I had used in the conversation, and yet that was her experience. So I send people to accountants, to attorneys, to therapists, to insurance specialists, all in the program, who are understanding what this process is all about, to deal with the specifics, because I don't have experience in those areas. Know where you have experience and know what your limits are, and send people to get suggestions from experienced and from professional people. I'm hoping that answered your question.
Yeah, that was very perfect.
Yeah.
Plus, I think it's good that with my sponsees, I communicate if they're going to tell me something criminal, that it can, their notes can be called up in court. So to say, if there's something criminal, this is what you do, and it's not with me, right?
Including child abuse.
Yeah.
Including child abuse. That can be, yeah. So anyway, these are common sense. I'm not an attorney. I'm not a therapist. I'm not a professional of any kind. I just have lots of experience, and I listen to the suggestions from professionals.
Yeah. Okay, thanks.
Yeah, no, I'm so glad that you asked that question. It's an area that I didn't get a chance to talk about. Thank you so much.
You mentioned something about guaranteed change when you were talking, but I missed it.
It's loose talk on my part based on my experience, but this is the way I interpret the process of the steps, is that on pages 84 and 85, when Bill says we enter the world of the spirit at the end of the 9th step and beginning the 10th step, he said we're placed in a position of neutrality. Hear the words. He doesn't qualify it. We are placed in a position of neutrality. To me, that's a guarantee of abstinence from your addiction. We are placed in a position of neutrality. We're not fighting it, he said. We're not resisting it. It's done to us, not by us. For me, that's a guarantee. And if you're not experiencing that, there's something amiss with steps 1 through 9. That's my conclusion. All right. But he also says we have a daily reprieve. That's a warning. We have a daily reprieve from our unmanageability. We're not cured of that, because that's the human condition. And we need to address that on a daily basis with 10, 11, and 12. Does that help?
I think so. The guarantee comes with being placed in a position of neutrality in your interpretation.
Well, you see, that to me bespeaks of grace.
Grace, right.
Yes. I am placed in it. I didn't get there. I didn't learn about it and strong arm it and 1 + 1 = 2. Yes. No. 1 + 1 = 5, because I was blown away by the impact. Once I finished the 9th step and looked back over my shoulder, I had been in a monastery for 7 years and I had not experienced change. I had been in psychology for 5 or 6 years and I had not experienced change. I had been in AA for 4 years and I hadn't experienced change. I did these steps in my 5th year and I was radically changed. And the word radical comes from the Latin radix, meaning at the root level. I was changed. I became a decent human being, or began to develop at least directionally, that metamorphosis. Yeah.
It's tough to let go of the image that you had or the action that you had that is not available to me.
Yeah.
And so I struggle with that.
Yeah. 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 And lean into the reality as you've described it of a process.
Okay.
Yeah. That it's part of the struggle for the butterfly in the chrysalis to come out of the chrysalis shell. It's part of the struggle that gives them the strength in the wings to fly. If we were to break the chrysalis to help them get out of the shell, they wouldn't be able to fly because they wouldn't have developed the strength. Isn't that a wonderful sort of a support for you there? Yeah. Yeah. And then I did promise, and you've reminded me of it, of two things. People that you can't find or that you can't make an amends to that you feel would be helpful both to you and to the other person, that you just can't do it because either they're not willing or you can't find them. And this is what I meant by you can finish your amends. There were people that I couldn't find because I didn't even know their names, or it was 20 or 30 years and there wasn't the internet back in the 80s. Or my sponsor had indicated through questions that I shouldn't find them, that it would be harmful for me to, in fact, bring up the past in their face. Now, that was a decision that sometimes my thoughts were that I shouldn't make the amend because it would harm them. And he said, no, you're worried because it'll harm you. And then it says, well, I should find them because no, that's you have corrupt motives in trying to find them. So I listened to his questions. He never told me what to do. But on the ones that I decided that I either couldn't find or shouldn't find, I created a prayer practice. This is not in the big book or the 12 and 12, but it was the step guide suggestion to create a prayer practice for their healing. And if it was a minor kind of an injury, maybe 3 days or 1 day. And if it's a moderate, maybe 2 weeks or 3 weeks. And if it's a major hurt and you can't find them or you shouldn't find them, then for maybe 3 months daily, you pray for their healing. And I was able on that basis to finish all my amends because I was able to create a spiritual practice. On the other hand, there's the comment about living amends. And I hear it misused in the meetings by my interpretation. And that is, oh, I'm making all my amends by living better and I'm a better person and I show up early and I stay late and I'm helpful. And so I don't have to make amends to anybody else because I'm making amends to the universe. Well, good luck with that fantasy. All right. Because I don't believe in that a bit. I believe that's horseshit. Right. It's not in the big book. But anyway, that's my belief. Living amends is living differently. So my wife really liked a clean kitchen when she woke up in the morning to make coffee. She really enjoyed her coffee. Now, without a conversation with her, but knowing that if I came home late because I was out at meetings or doing whatever I do Monday through Thursday, when I came home and maybe she was in bed asleep already and the kitchen was a little disheveled, I would clean it up. I would make the coffee or get it ready for her in the morning. I never told her that. She never asked me that. 5 years of my doing that. One day, very quietly, as we were preparing some dinner one time, she goes, oh, by the way, I really appreciate the clean kitchen and the coffee being prepared. But you see, it was like, that was my living amends to her to make her life a little easier, trying to compensate for the hard life I had given her for the first 25 years. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I recently went through a step process with an intensive workshop, and he was very strong in the belief that when you make amends, It is a very selfish act. You're doing it for yourself, and you're not doing it for.
All right, so I'm going to refer you from my standpoint, he's made a incorrect interpretation of the big book. I wonder what it means when it says, at the moment, we are trying to put our lives in order, but this is not an end to itself. Our real purpose is to fit ourselves to be a maximum service to God and the people about us. I don't think there's much of an interpretation necessary there. I don't want to get into the semantics of it. I mean, the flight attendant says, put your mask on first, and then you can help somebody else. Whether it's about you or about them, it's about making amends. And if your motives are a little mixed, it's fine. Of course, we're doing the amends process so that we will stay sober. But he says, Bill does, in the big book, the primary purpose is to be useful to God and the people about us. So anyway, does that help?
Yes. My other question was about restitution, that if someone says it's okay, you don't need to repay the financial restitution, there is a lot out there that says you still have to do it, and that it is still like a mark on you, and until you make some form of restitution, you will not be relieved of the burden.
Well, as I mentioned, I believe that needs interpretation, because there are some situations where I would agree that would be appropriate, and it's about common sense, it's about prayer, and it's about direction from experienced person, not with people who are rigorous or fundamentalist about their approach. If somebody says to me, I say to my former boss, I stole, I'll be very blunt, I stole through my expense account 6 figures plus. And he goes, you know what? Let's call bygones be bygones. You are forgiven. You are released. And by the way, here's a $60,000 car. I have no further action that's necessary. I don't owe the company. I don't owe the world anything.
Mm-hmm.
So in the area of amends to women, which is eternal in my estimation for myself, I have stayed connected with the House of Hope, making a physical time contribution as well as a financial contribution for the last 30 to 32 years, because there's no way that I can balance the scale for the harm that I did to the known and unknown women in my life.
Mm-hmm.
So I feel an obligation from my standpoint to have a continuity there. In contrast to finishing it off, there's a continuity here. But we have to be careful about guilt and shame too.
Yeah, that's what I was just going to ask you. If I'm still have a feeling that I haven't suffered enough,
Yeah.
is that the guilt and the shame that's coming up, that's making me feel like I need to do this?
Yeah, that's a neurosis.
Hmm.
That's unhealthy. Excuse me. That's potentially unhealthy. There's good shame healthy shame and unhealthy shame. There's healthy guilt and unhealthy guilt. If you're robbing banks, you're guilty of robbing banks.
Mm-hmm.
But if you have been raised in one of the households that has a cultural predisposition to put guilt on children, I mean, everybody knows what I mean by that. If you're Irish or German or Polish or Jewish or whatever the cultures are, then the guilt is an unhealthy thing. And you need to somehow grow out of that by shedding it through this spiritual practice.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, same with the shame. Guilt is a negative feeling about my behavior, whereas shame is a negative feeling about my very being. Very much deeper and very much relevant, certainly, to this conversation, not mentioned at all in the big book. but it's something that I incorporate in my 4-step instructions, that people plumb the depths of their guilt and shame so that they can at least identify it and then attempt to make it whole and bring healing to it. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. I try not to be black and white. I try not to be rigid. I try to be all inclusive because I want to incorporate what I perceive to be the culture of the big book, the culture of Bill Wilson, the culture of the 12-step fellowship. There's no rules. Bill Wilson said there's only 2 disciplines in Alcoholics Anonymous. There's only 2 disciplines. We don't need rules. We don't need regulations. We don't need laws. There's only 2 disciplines. One is God and one is alcohol. You're either going for one or you're going for the other. In my current terms, I would say there are only 2 directions for us as human beings, going toward the light or going toward the darkness. There's no in between. There's only 2 directions for us as human beings. There's no standing still. That dimmer switch is on a greased axle and it's wired to go backwards. So I keep my shoulder into it. I lean gently into the dimmer switch. That's my role. That's my willingness. That's my action. And then the outcome of what happens with my action and the outcome is grace. Because as I said before, 1 + 1 = 5. I cannot get here where I am today on my own power. I tried that in the monastery. I tried that in psychology. I tried that in AA. None of those brought me. The steps brought me to where I found the solution, and that solution has been the light, and the light gets brighter as I stay gently pressed up against it. Yeah, I don't believe I've ever said it that way before, but that's a nice summary of my journey. Make sense?
It does. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
I also have the situation where I have sponsees who and it's also in my family where we have mental illness in our family. So some of the people that either I would go to or they would go to make amends are mentally ill, right?
Yeah,
so for me, is there any guidance on, because I've told them that they have to do their amends differently because first of all, the person receiving the amends will not receive it well because they're mentally ill. I don't know, there's some judgment calls with that stuff because you don't want to harm the person by being too brutally honest with them, right?
It's not about being brutally honest. This is not therapy.
Yeah.
No. Get really clear.
No.
This isn't about therapy.
Explain that to me.
This is not about therapy. This is about a spiritual process where you're bringing repair to them. You're not teaching them a lesson. You're not describing the emotional impact of your relationship on yourself. That's therapy. Go for it in the therapy session. But that's not what this is. This is, how can I help this person heal? And you're right, common sense, practicality. And if it's mental illness, do what, my favorite line is, do what you can do what you will do, and do what's in the best interest of helping them. And that's why I really have a hesitation when somebody says, well, this is about me and my getting well and my staying well and my having a spiritual experience. It's all true. But if you have the focus that this is about me, then you're not going to be there to help them get released, to bring healing to them, to repair the damage to them. So it's about the balance and it's about the emphasis. But it also would be about getting some professional direction. If you're dealing with mental illness, you might need, and I've sent people to marriage counselors or behavioral modification people or trauma therapists in order to kind of sort out what's the best way to approach these people. Yeah.
Yeah, my one other second part of the question is when the person who you need to make amends to is a very harmful person to you,
Yeah.
like you definitely owe that person amends, right? Because of your behavior and your actions, but they also could like re-hurt you again in the process, right? So how to deal with that
Right.
is
Well,
very challenging, right?
I've, in the last 20 years, a lot of the people have had a drug addiction, and therefore they have drug dealers that they deal with, and they've stolen money or drugs from them. And they need to make amends to their drug dealer. Oh, yeah, I'm very clear on that. You need to make amends to your drug dealer for taking their money or taking their drugs. Well, how do you do that when it's pretty dangerous sometimes? Well, you do it with common sense. Sometimes you do it at a distance, telephone or email. And if you're going to make it face to face, you might bring two of the heftiest people you can from your 12-step meeting with you so that you're not putting yourself in harm's way. You know what I mean? Yeah. So it's about common sense here. Mm-hmm. Now, another point that it's been made over several of the stories or questions. I have a very strong feeling about Chapter 11 in the United States. That's bankruptcy. Bankruptcy is a wonderful legal tool to get some breath, to get some freedom, to stop the bleeding financially. But it's not a moral or spiritual release from the debt, from my standpoint. So people who have claimed Chapter 11 bankruptcy, I tell them to talk to an attorney and to an accountant, because I'm not either one of those, but they need to make restitution to the debt that they got relief from my standpoint. Does that help?
Yeah, that's very helpful. I'm just that's another one. I didn't even think about the bank because that's come up too with sponsees too. So
I'm not saying I'm right at all. One of my best friends is a CPA. Now he is more liberal in his own philosophy, but he's 35 years sober and he's got a good program. He disagrees with me on that. We agree to disagree, that's all.
Well, I think the part that I agree with is if you go through bankruptcy, which I did 20 years ago, there is a guilt and shame that goes with you because that happened to you, right? That you have to somehow deal with, and it helps to deal with it financially, right? Because then you feel like you have grown up and taken care of yourself, you're self-supporting through your own contributions, and you paid the people that you reamed with the money, So I get what you're saying about there's some kind of amends that could be made for bankruptcy. I'm just not sure exactly what that would be. And I guess you have to maybe come up with a plan individually.
Oh, it's very individual, individual in prayer with an accountant, with an attorney. I'm not saying don't do this blindly. You need a lot of qualified help and support and advice here. Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
Yeah. The same with paying IRS. Don't willy-nilly go dancing into an IRS office without advice from an accountant or an attorney. Oh my God, you will get reamed. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Yeah, and student loans too. That's another one too.
I've not had that addressed, but yes, it would be. Yes.
Like when people default on their student loans kind of thing.
That's where professional advice will come in very, very handy. Not long-term senior people in the AA program or whatever your program is, because they may not really be experts and not know. I'm talking about professional attorneys, CPAs, etc. Yeah. Business people. Thank you so much.
I have had people make amends to me about how they have judged me for something that I have said. Yeah. And another one is how they've talked about me behind my back.
Right.
Those two things I felt were hurtful to hear, because now when I think of that person, I think of what they're judging and what did you say behind my back? And so years later, I still have that. So those are defects, right? And so I'm wondering how they could have made those amends that wouldn't have been so hurtful, or whether they
were
didn't owe them
ignorant.
in the first place.
No, they were ignorant. They were following direction of somebody who didn't know. Yeah, no, that's right. They had no assessment as to whether they harmed you or not, and they had no assessment as to whether this was going to harm you or not. No, they were misinformed at the best and ignorant at the worst. Yep. Yep.
So no amends was required, right?
Correct. In either of the situations. On the way you presented it, no amends was necessary on their part. And now you got to deal with your discomfort because that's your problem.
Exactly. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I wanted to divorce my wife at 25 years of sobriety. So I did the steps again the second time. And I was in a hurry, so I got them done in 6 months. And at the end of the 6 months, I realized I was the problem. Yeah, she wasn't the problem. Oh, she had problems, but she wasn't the problem. I was the problem. Yeah.
That's like the doctor who was taking his wife in the big book, the story. He was taking his wife to the psych ward, and it was really him that was the problem. Yeah. Oh God, that's so good. Right. The acceptance is the answer, doctor.
Yes, Dr. Paul.
Maxine or whatever her name was.
Paul and Maxine, great story, actually. Yeah. They did couples retreats in our area for a long time. Yeah, they were great.
Nice.
Thought of myself as one of those people that's super plugged into the infinite. Like I know when I'm in God, and what's been scary for me having these panic attacks and literally a few days ago was how in the dark I felt so much in the dark, and it's been so where I actually questioned, is there actually a God, even though in my being I know that. And so it's just been such a blessing tonight to log on to this workshop. I read my pages 60 to 63 this morning and did my meditation, which I haven't done for 18 months. And it's just that experience of the reminder of knowing, like you say, there's two things: you're either in the light or in the dark. And I just wanted to say thanks for helping me plug back into the light to everyone. So thank you.
That's a wonderful confirmation for the value of what we're doing here. And I just really appreciate that. You put a log on my fire so I can keep burning.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, it's great. All right, so please join me in this prayer. Listen to the turning. Listen to the promise. Feel and experience the process. This is a very apt prayer for what we've just talked about. Maybe that's why Bill has it in step 11 in the 12 and 12, often referred to as the step 11 prayer. Lord, make me a channel of your peace, that where there is hatred, I may bring love, that where there is wrong, I may bring the spirit of forgiveness, that where there is discord, I may bring harmony, that where there is error, I may bring truth, that where there is doubt, I may bring faith, that where there is despair, I may bring hope, that where there are shadows, I may bring light, that where there is sadness, I may bring joy. Lord, grant that I may seek rather to comfort than to be comforted, to understand than to be understood, to love than to be loved. For it is by self-forgetting that one finds, it is by forgiving that one is forgiven, it is by dying that one awakens to eternal life. Amen. Eckhart Tolle in The Power of Now has a line. I quote it every time I read that prayer and finish a workshop. Eckhart Tolle in The Power of Now. He says, the secret to life is to die before you die and realize there is no death. You see, steps 4 through 9 is the death of the false self so that the authentic and true self can emerge and live a life of freedom. That's where we're at, freedom. That's our goal, freedom. Freedom certainly from the addiction at the minimum, but freedom from our attachment to our delusions about reality. That's the magic. But it requires action on our part. Thanks, everybody.